On the 28th day of May in 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz found himself standing in water up to his ankles at the base of Pearl Harbor's first dry dock. His uniform, made of khaki fabric, had already absorbed enough moisture to turn several shades darker. All around him, workers from the shipyard operated massive pumps to drain water from the enormous concrete structure, while others carefully inspected the damaged hull of an aircraft carrier that towered above them all. This was the Yorktown, freshly returned from engaging Japanese forces in what history would remember as the Battle of the Coral Sea. The vessel bore visible wounds from enemy bombs and explosions that had occurred nearby. Metal plates had been torn apart, rivets had been sheared clean off, and the hull had sustained such severe damage that the ship had left behind a trail of leaked oil stretching 10 miles across the ocean during its journey back to Hawaiian waters. The ship's commander, Captain Elliot Buckmaster, directed the Admiral's attention to an especially troubling section along the port side of the vessel. He explained that an entire section measuring 24 feet required complete replacement. The hull had buckled inward, and the majority of the structural frame supporting it from behind had been warped beyond any possibility of repair. Nimitz responded with a silent nod, his weathered face showing no emotion as he methodically examined each area of damage. Standing nearby was Pearl Harbor's most experienced superintendent of the yard, Captain Claude Gillette, who held a clipboard containing preliminary estimates for the repair work. When Nimitz finally asked for his professional assessment, Gillette responded without any hesitation. He stated that the minimum time required would be 3 months at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. The damage was simply too extensive. They would need to reconstruct entire sections of the ship's internal structure. Nimitz turned to face both officers directly. Water continued swirling around his ankles as the pumps worked to empty the dry dock. His next statement would shock everyone present and would set in motion one of the most extraordinary feats of emergency naval repair that history has ever witnessed. He declared that they must have this ship back and ready for service in 3 days. A profound silence followed as the men exchanged uncertain glances. Convinced they must have misunderstood what they had just heard, Buckmaster finally managed to speak, asking for confirmation that the Admiral had said 3 days. Nimitz replied firmly that yes, it was 3 days. He went on to explain that their intelligence had indicated the Japanese were planning a major operation against Midway Atoll. They would arrive there with 4 aircraft carriers on the 4th of June. He needed the Yorktown ready to depart by the 30th of May. Lieutenant Commander H.J. Finstag, recognized as the yard's leading expert on hull repair, swallowed hard before responding with a simple affirmative. In that moment, as they stood in the gradually draining dry dock, none of the men fully understood how their next 72 hours of work would fundamentally alter the course of the war in the Pacific. Nor could they have possibly known that across the vast expanse of ocean, a Japanese admiral named Isoroku Yamamoto was putting the finishing touches on Operation MI, the planned invasion of Midway, with one absolutely crucial assumption underlying all his plans. He believed that the Yorktown was either resting at the bottom of the Coral Sea or so badly damaged that it would remain out of action for many months to come. The race against time had officially begun. To understand the full significance of this moment, we must turn back the clock to the 7th of December in 1941, when Pearl Harbor in Hawaii became the target of a surprise Japanese attack that left the United States Pacific Fleet in ruins. 8 battleships had been either sunk or damaged, along with numerous cruisers and destroyers. In what would later prove to be a stroke of fortune that would become decisive, not a single one of America's aircraft carriers happened to be in port that day. In the months that followed this devastating attack, the United States Navy struggled desperately to recover, while Japanese forces swept across the Pacific Ocean like an unstoppable tide. The Philippines fell to Japanese control. Singapore surrendered. The Dutch East Indies were completely overrun. By April of 1942, Japan had successfully established a defensive perimeter that stretched all the way from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Islands, effectively controlling a vast oceanic empire. America's initial response was limited in scope, but carried symbolic importance that would resonate throughout both nations. The Doolittle raid of April 18th saw 16 B-25 bombers launched from the deck of the carrier Hornet to strike Tokyo directly. While the raid held little military significance in terms of actual damage inflicted, it shocked Japanese leadership who had assured their population that the home islands were completely invulnerable to any form of attack. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had served as the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, recognized that America's industrial might would eventually overwhelm Japan unless decisive action was taken immediately. The Doolittle raid convinced him that eliminating America's remaining carrier force had become an urgent priority that could not be delayed. He reportedly told his staff that American courage was not in question, but that it was time they dealt with American carriers once and for all. By early May, Yamamoto had begun detailed preparations for Operation MI, a complex plan designed to lure United States carriers into a decisive battle near Midway Atoll, where overwhelming Japanese naval power would destroy them completely. The operation would include a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands and would deploy a massive fleet including 4 fleet carriers named Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. What Yamamoto did not know was that American cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort at a station called Hypo in Pearl Harbor had partially broken the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. Working around the clock in a basement facility, Rochefort's team had determined that a major Japanese operation against a target identified only as AF was imminent. Through a clever ruse involving having Midway broadcast an uncoded message claiming their freshwater distillation plant had broken down, they confirmed that AF was indeed Midway, when Japanese messages subsequently mentioned the water shortage at that location. Admiral Nimitz now possessed knowledge of the Japanese plan, including the approximate timing and the forces that would be involved. But knowledge alone would not be sufficient to meet this threat. To counter the Japanese attack, he needed every available carrier at his disposal. The carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, forming Task Force 16 under Admiral Raymond Spruance, were available for deployment, but they would still be outnumbered by Japan's 4 carriers. A third American carrier would significantly improve the odds of success. The Yorktown, despite its battle damage, represented Nimitz's only option for achieving this numerical balance. The Yorktown had just emerged from the Battle of the Coral Sea, which had been fought from May 4th through May 8th of 1942. This engagement marked the first naval battle in all of history where the opposing ships never actually sighted each other directly, with all attacks being carried out exclusively by aircraft. During this engagement, American carriers Yorktown and Lexington had successfully prevented a Japanese invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea and had managed to sink a light carrier. However, Japanese aircraft had succeeded in sinking the Lexington and had severely damaged the Yorktown in the process. A 551-pound armor-piercing bomb had penetrated through the Yorktown's flight deck and exploded deep inside the ship, killing or wounding 66 men in the blast. The explosion had destroyed multiple compartments and had damaged the ship's boilers, which limited its maximum speed capability. Near misses from other bombs had buckled the hull plating and had opened seams, causing flooding and an oil leak that would persist throughout its journey home. Initial assessments from Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch suggested that repairs would require 90 days to complete properly. The Japanese, who had been tracking the damaged Yorktown as it limped away from the battle area while trailing oil, had every reason to believe the carrier was permanently out of action, if not actually sunk. This crucial misconception would form the very foundation of their planning for the upcoming Midway operation. As Captain Buckmaster guided the wounded Yorktown back to Pearl Harbor at reduced speed, neither he nor any member of his crew could have possibly imagined that in less than a month they would again face the same Japanese carriers that had inflicted damage on their ship, but this time under very different circumstances. On the 27th of May in 1942, the Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor one day ahead of its anticipated schedule, having maintained a steady 20 knots, despite trailing oil for much of its 3,000-mile journey. As the carrier approached its designated berth, crowds of naval personnel gathered to witness its arrival. The damage was visible even from a considerable distance. There was a patched hole in the flight deck, scarred hull plating, and the unmistakable list that characterized a wounded vessel struggling to maintain stability. In his headquarters overlooking the harbor, Admiral Nimitz was meeting with Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose intelligence team had been working without any rest to decode Japanese transmissions. Rochefort explained that the Japanese would attack Midway on June 4th. Nagumo's carrier force would approach from the northwest, while Yamamoto followed with the main body, which included battleships and a landing force. When Nimitz asked if the Japanese still believed the Yorktown had been sunk at Coral Sea, Rochefort confirmed that yes, their intelligence reports mentioned only 2 operational American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. They were expecting to outnumber American forces 2-1. Nimitz moved to the window, watching as tugboats maneuvered the Yorktown into its berth. He remarked quietly that they would need to give the Japanese a surprise they would not forget. Within hours, Nimitz had assembled a planning team that included Pearl Harbor's yard superintendent, Captain Claude Gillette, hull repair expert Lieutenant Commander H.J. Finstag, and engineering officer Commander Arnold True. Their task was to determine whether the seemingly impossible repair timeline could actually be achieved through any means available. Nimitz began by asking the gentlemen for their honest assessment of whether the Yorktown could be made battle-worthy in 3 days. The room fell into silence as the men exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, Gillette spoke up. He explained that standard procedure for a carrier with this level of damage would require 3 months in a major shipyard. Even if they focused on making only critical repairs, conventional wisdom suggested 2 weeks as an absolute minimum. Nimitz replied that he was not interested in conventional wisdom. He was interested in what could be accomplished when the fate of the entire Pacific Fleet depended on achieving the impossible. Finstag, the hull specialist, cleared his throat before speaking. He suggested that they could weld rather than rivet the damaged hull sections. It would not be as strong or as long-lasting as proper riveting, but it would definitely be faster. Commander True added that they could focus exclusively on systems that were absolutely necessary for combat operations. Anything that did not directly affect the ship's fighting capability could wait for later repairs. When Nimitz asked about manpower requirements, Gillette replied that they would need every welder, every machinist, and every yard worker who was available, all working around the clock in continuous shifts. Nimitz assured him that he would have them. He authorized unlimited overtime, priority requisition of any materials that might be needed, and full electrical power, even if they had to dim the lights throughout all of Honolulu to achieve it. By evening, the plan had taken definite shape. Critical repairs would focus on 3 specific areas. First, the hull damage needed to be addressed to ensure watertight integrity. Second, the flight deck had to be repaired to enable aircraft operations. Third, the propulsion system required work to provide adequate speed for combat operations. Non-essential systems would be completely ignored for the time being. The work would proceed without any formal blueprints or detailed planning documents. Yard supervisors would consult the ship's original construction diagrams and would make decisions on the spot as situations arose. Captain Buckmaster, though deeply skeptical of the timeline being proposed, threw himself fully into organizing the ship's crew to assist with the repairs. Damage control parties who had fought valiantly to save the ship during and after the Coral Sea battle would now work side by side with yard workers to resurrect it for one more mission. Meanwhile, Japanese planning for Operation MI continued with full confidence in their intelligence assessments. At his headquarters aboard the massive battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto finalized the complex battle plan that involved multiple force groups operating across thousands of miles of ocean. Vice Admiral Nagumo, commander of the 1st Carrier Striking Force, reviewed intelligence reports concerning the American carriers with great satisfaction. One report confirmed that Lexington had been sunk at Coral Sea. Another stated that Yorktown had been heavily damaged with an estimated repair time of a minimum of 3 months. The report concluded that only Enterprise and Hornet remained operational in the Pacific theater. This assessment reinforced Japanese confidence in their 4-2 carrier advantage, a confidence that would prove tragically misplaced in the coming days. At Pearl Harbor, as the Yorktown entered dry dock number 1 on the morning of May 28th, an unprecedented industrial effort was about to commence. 1,400 shipyard workers were being organized into 3 separate shifts that would work continuously around the clock. Hawaii Electric Company had been notified that the shipyard would require maximum power output, which would necessitate rolling blackouts throughout the city of Honolulu. In just 72 hours, they would attempt what Japanese naval planners considered absolutely impossible. On the 29th of May in 1942, at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, the sound was absolutely deafening. Hundreds of pneumatic hammers, welding torches, and cutting equipment created a constant industrial roar that echoed throughout the interior spaces of the Yorktown's hull. Blue-white arcs from welding torches illuminated the interior spaces where men worked in severely cramped conditions, often standing in water that still leaked through damaged sections that had not yet been sealed. Lieutenant Commander Finstag moved through the organized chaos, methodically checking on critical repair areas throughout the ship. The damaged hull plating on the port side had been cut away entirely, and new sections were being welded into place by skilled workers. Rather than replacing the damaged internal frames, a job that would normally require weeks of careful work, workers were installing temporary wooden supports that would hold the structure together. As Finstag explained to a visiting officer, it was not pretty, and it certainly was not permanent, but it would hold together for a few weeks, and that was all they actually needed. On the flight deck above, another team was completing repairs to the bomb damage that had been inflicted during the Coral Sea engagement. The 5-foot hole had already been patched with new steel plating, but the supporting structure beneath still required significant reinforcement to handle the stresses of flight operations. Again, where steel supports would normally be installed according to standard procedures, shipyard workers were using heavy wooden timbers instead, consciously sacrificing longevity for speed of completion. Captain Buckmaster watched the work with deeply mixed emotions. As the Yorktown's commanding officer, he took immense pride in his ship and its capabilities, but he harbored grave concerns about sending it back into combat with such obviously makeshift repairs holding it together. He asked Commander Arnold True, who was overseeing the engineering repairs, whether it would really hold together under combat conditions. True admitted candidly that in normal times he would never certify these repairs as seaworthy by any standard measure. But these were not normal times by any definition. The welds would hold against normal sea stresses, and the wooden supports should withstand the forces involved in flight operations. Beyond that, he simply shrugged and acknowledged they were betting on American engineering skills and perhaps a little bit of luck as well. Below decks, another critical issue was being systematically addressed. The ship's boilers had been damaged during the battle, which significantly limited its top speed capability. Complete repairs to the boiler system would require months of specialized work, but engineers had devised an ingenious workaround by bypassing the damaged superheaters to restore partial functionality. The Yorktown would not reach its full design speed of 33 knots, but it could manage somewhere between 28 and 30 knots, which would be sufficient to launch and recover aircraft during combat operations. Beyond the physical repairs to the ship itself, other critical preparations were underway simultaneously. The Yorktown's air group had suffered significant losses during the Coral Sea engagement and desperately needed reinforcement. With the carrier Saratoga undergoing its own repairs on the west coast, some of its aircraft and pilots were transferred to Pearl Harbor by transport ship to join the Yorktown squadrons. These new pilots had precious little time to familiarize themselves with the ship's specific procedures and quirks. Lieutenant Commander Oscar Pedersen, who commanded the Yorktown's fighter squadron VF-3, worked frantically to integrate the replacement pilots and aircraft into his existing squadron structure. He told Captain Buckmaster candidly that they would be going into combat with some pilots who had never even landed on this particular carrier before. It was far from an ideal situation, but the pilots were all well trained, and they would adapt to the circumstances as necessary. Throughout all these preparations, intelligence continued to flow steadily from Commander Rochefort's team at Station Hypo. New decoded messages confirmed both the Japanese timetable and the force composition they would be facing. Most critically, the messages revealed that Japanese intelligence still believed the Yorktown was completely out of action, a misconception that American forces were now working around the clock to exploit to maximum advantage. Admiral Nimitz made multiple visits to the dry dock during the repair effort, and each time he found himself marveling at the progress that had been achieved. During one inspection tour, he stopped to speak directly with a welder who had been working for nearly 18 consecutive hours without any real break. Nimitz asked the exhausted worker how much longer he could possibly keep up this brutal pace. The welder looked up from his torch with tired but determined eyes and replied that he would continue as long as it takes. He explained that everyone working on the ship knew exactly what was at stake in this effort. This sentiment permeated the entire repair operation. Every single worker understood that their welding torch, their wrench, or their hammer represented America's direct response to the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Yorktown had become much more than just a ship in their minds. It had transformed into a powerful symbol of American resilience and industrial might that would send a clear message to the enemy. As the second day of intensive repairs concluded, Captain Gillette provided an update to Nimitz that seemed almost too good to be true. Against all reasonable expectations, they were actually ahead of the proposed schedule. The hull repairs were nearly complete. The flight deck was fully operational. and engineers reported that the propulsion system would be ready for sea trials by the following morning. Gillette admitted to the Admiral that he had never seen anything quite like this achievement in his entire career. They were accomplishing 3 months' worth of work in just 3 days. Nimitz replied with quiet confidence that this was exactly what he had expected. He explained that when Americans truly understand what is at stake, there is nothing they cannot accomplish when they set their minds to it. Across the vast Pacific Ocean, Japanese forces were already in motion toward their objective. Admiral Nagumo's carrier force had departed from Hashirajima anchorage on May 26th, steaming steadily east toward Midway Atoll. In his flagship Akagi, Nagumo reviewed the operational plans one final time, feeling completely confident in Japanese naval superiority. His 4 carriers carried a combined force of over 275 aircraft, representing a striking power that had already devastated Pearl Harbor and had swept Allied forces from throughout the Western Pacific. Nagumo told his staff officers with absolute certainty that the Americans would respond with Enterprise and Hornet once they struck Midway. When they did respond, Japan would be waiting with overwhelming force to crush them decisively. Neither Nagumo nor any other Japanese commander could possibly imagine that a third American carrier, one they firmly believed was either sunk or months away from repair, was being frantically restored to fighting condition through an unprecedented, industrial effort that defied all their assumptions about American capabilities. At precisely 6:30 in the morning on May 30th in 1942, the Yorktown emerged from dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor Naval Base. Its hull had been freshly painted to conceal the hasty repairs that had been completed. To casual observers watching from shore, the carrier showed no obvious signs whatsoever of the severe damage it had suffered less than a month earlier during the Coral Sea engagement. Only those who had actually worked on the ship knew the real truth hidden beneath its restored exterior. The Yorktown was held together by emergency welds, wooden supports, and above all, by the sheer determination of its crew to return to battle. Captain Buckmaster stood on the bridge, watching carefully as tugboats maneuvered the carrier away from the dock and toward open water. He had slept barely 8 hours total over the past 3 days, having spent virtually all his time overseeing repairs and preparing his crew for what was to come. Now, as the Yorktown moved under its own power for the first time since entering Pearl Harbor, he felt both tremendous pride in what had been accomplished and deep apprehension about what lay ahead. The engine room reported that all systems were functioning within acceptable parameters. They were maintaining 20 knots with no unusual vibration detected in the hull or machinery. Buckmaster nodded in acknowledgement. The shipyard workers had accomplished what many reasonable people had considered completely impossible, making the Yorktown battle-worthy in just 72 hours. Whether their hasty repairs would actually withstand the stresses of combat conditions remained to be seen, but at least they had a fighting chance. On the pier, Admiral Nimitz watched the carrier's departure alongside Lieutenant Commander Finstag, the hull repair specialist who had overseen so much of the critical work. Nimitz remarked that she looked good, didn't she? Finstag replied affirmatively, though his expression revealed lingering concerns about the work they had done. He stated that the repairs should hold for at least a few weeks under normal conditions. Nimitz replied simply that a few weeks was all they actually needed, just long enough to meet the Japanese at Midway and give them the surprise of their lives. As the Yorktown moved steadily toward the harbor entrance, it passed directly by the sunken hulk of the battleship Arizona, which served as a grim reminder of the surprise attack 6 months earlier that had plunged America into this war. Many of the men aboard the Yorktown silently acknowledged the symbolic connection between their current mission and the Arizona's terrible sacrifice. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commander of Task Force 17 with Yorktown serving as his flagship, joined Buckmaster on the bridge as they cleared the harbor. Fletcher had led the American forces at Coral Sea and would now command the combined American carrier force at the upcoming Midway engagement. Fletcher observed to the captain that the yard workers had performed what could only be described as a genuine miracle. The Japanese would be quite surprised to see them appear in battle. Buckmaster replied dryly that he hoped the Japanese did not get too close a look at their ship. They were seaworthy enough for combat, but they certainly were not pretty underneath the fresh paint. Throughout that day, the Yorktown conducted abbreviated sea trials to test its engines, steering systems, and flight operations capabilities. Despite the limited superheater capacity in the damaged boiler system, the carrier managed to reach 28 knots, which was sufficient for launching and recovering aircraft under most conditions. Flight deck crews practiced emergency repair procedures extensively, knowing full well that battle damage during combat might require extremely quick fixes to maintain continuous air operations. By evening, the Yorktown was as ready for war as it could possibly be given the circumstances. As the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, Fletcher gave the order that would send the hastily repaired carrier toward its rendezvous with destiny. He commanded the helmsman to set course for Midway at a speed of 20 knots. Nearly 4,000 miles to the west, Admiral Nagumo's carrier force continued its eastward journey while maintaining strict radio silence to avoid detection. On June 1st, they would be joined by the Midway occupation force and the main body under Yamamoto himself. The massive Japanese fleet, representing the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the Pacific theater, moved with supreme confidence toward what they believed would be a decisive victory that would eliminate American carrier power once and for all. Neither Nagumo nor Yamamoto had even the slightest inkling that their carefully constructed trap was about to be turned completely against them. American codebreakers had revealed their plans in remarkable detail, and the supposedly crippled Yorktown was steaming steadily to join Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway. The stage was now set for one of history's most consequential naval battles, an engagement in which the hastily repaired Yorktown would play an absolutely crucial role before ultimately meeting its final fate beneath the waves. The first rays of dawn on June 4th in 1942 illuminated the flight deck of the Yorktown as flight crews prepared aircraft for the coming battle. The carrier was positioned northeast of Midway Atoll as part of Task Force 17. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Fletcher studied the latest intelligence reports alongside Captain Buckmaster. A Japanese carrier force had been detected approaching Midway from the northwest, exactly as had been predicted by Rochefort's codebreakers with remarkable accuracy. Fletcher ordered the immediate launch of search aircraft and directed his staff to prepare a full strike package as soon as they obtained a confirmed position on the enemy carriers. Below decks, Engineering Officer Lieutenant Commander John Delaney moved carefully through the makeshift repair areas, methodically checking the hastily welded seams and temporary wooden supports that were literally holding the carrier together. The ship had been at sea for 5 days now, and remarkably the emergency repairs were holding up reasonably well, though strange creaks and groans echoed through the hull during high-speed maneuvers and sharp turns. Chief Machinist's mate Claude Rickenbacker, who had supervised much of the machinery repair work back at Pearl Harbor, asked Delaney how the ship was holding up under operational conditions. Delaney replied that it was performing better than he had expected, and he knocked on one of the wooden support beams for good luck. Those yard workers at Pearl Harbor had done one hell of a job under impossible circumstances. Neither man voiced what both were thinking privately, which was that the Yorktown's hastily repaired systems would very soon face the ultimate test in actual combat against a determined enemy. At 9:48 in the morning, a scout plane radioed an electrifying message back to the fleet. Enemy carriers sighted. The pilot reported seeing 2 Japanese carriers as part of Nagumo's force, located approximately 175 miles from the American task force. Position: Fletcher immediately ordered a full strike to be launched from the Yorktown while simultaneously coordinating actions with Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded Enterprise and Hornet in Task Force 16. By 10:30, the Yorktown's air group was airborne and heading toward the enemy. The strike force consisted of 17 dive bombers, 12 torpedo bombers, and 6 fighters, all heading toward the reported position of the Japanese carriers, with their crews fully aware they were about to make history. What followed in the next few hours would become one of the most decisive naval engagements in all of recorded history. American dive bombers from Enterprise struck the Japanese carriers Kaga and Akagi with devastating accuracy, while Yorktown's bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the devastating Pearl Harbor attack and was now recovering from appendicitis, made it his mission to interview survivors from the 4 lost carriers. He was absolutely stunned to learn of the Yorktown's presence at the battle. He asked repeatedly, almost obsessively, how the Americans could possibly have repaired the ship so quickly. He pointed out that their own yards would require many months for similar damage, and yet the Americans had accomplished it in mere days. The answer to his question lay in America's superior industrial organization, technical innovation, and perhaps most importantly, the extraordinary determination of Pearl Harbor's diverse workforce. The 1,400 workers who had labored around the clock for 72 continuous hours represented America's true secret weapon, an industrial capacity that Japan simply could not match no matter how hard they tried. At Pearl Harbor, the naval shipyard received formal commendation directly from Admiral Nimitz himself. Captain Gillette, who had overseen the Miraculous repair effort, gathered all the key supervisors and engineers to share the news of Yorktown's crucial role in the victory at Midway. He told them with obvious emotion that what they had accomplished in just 3 days had helped fundamentally change the entire course of the war. Though the Yorktown had been severely damaged again and might not survive, it had served long enough to help sink one Japanese carrier directly and to fight off attacks that might otherwise have been directed against Enterprise or Hornet. Lieutenant Commander Finstag, the hull repair specialist who had somehow made the impossible deadline work through sheer determination and ingenuity, responded simply that they had only done what needed to be done. He stated with characteristic modesty that any American shipyard would have done exactly the same thing if placed in similar circumstances. This matter-of-fact attitude characterized the American approach to what would become known as industrial warfare. While Japanese military culture placed tremendous emphasis on fighting spirit and tactical brilliance on the battlefield, American leaders were increasingly recognizing that ultimate victory would come through superior production capacity, technical innovation, and efficient logistics rather than battlefield heroics alone. The experience gained during the emergency repair of the Yorktown would directly inform American naval practice throughout the remainder of the war. Damage control techniques, emergency repair procedures, and organizational methods that had been developed during those 72 intense hours would be carefully codified and systematically taught to shipyard workers and naval personnel at bases across the entire Pacific. Theater, the human dimension of the repairs, represented an equally important legacy that would outlast the war itself. The diversity of the Pearl Harbor workforce, which included native Hawaiians, Japanese Americans working under constant suspicion after the Pearl Harbor attack, women entering industrial roles for the first time in their lives, and veteran shipwrights with decades of experience, demonstrated America's unique ability to unify diverse populations toward a common goal when the stakes were high enough. Unfortunately, the Yorktown story would have one final tragic chapter that would end its remarkable service. At 1:17 in the afternoon on June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168 successfully penetrated the screen of destroyers that had been protecting the wounded carrier. It fired 4 torpedoes at close range. 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown directly, and 1 hit the destroyer Hammond that was tied alongside, breaking the smaller ship completely in 2. The destroyer sank within minutes with heavy loss of life, while the Yorktown, having survived so much over such a long period, finally succumbed to its accumulated wounds. After remaining stubbornly afloat through the night, the carrier finally rolled over and sank at dawn on June 7th, taking with it all the physical evidence of the miracle repairs that had given it one final decisive mission that changed history. On July 15th, in 1942 at Imperial Japanese Navy, headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto sat in complete silence as staff officers presented their detailed analysis of the catastrophic Midway defeat. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots had fundamentally altered the strategic balance throughout the Pacific theater in ways that could not be easily reversed. But one particular aspect of the battle continued to deeply perplex Japanese planners and shake their confidence. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's senior staff officer, stated bluntly that their intelligence assessment of American repair capabilities had been catastrophically wrong in its basic assumptions. The Yorktown's unexpected presence at Midway demonstrated repair speeds that they had previously considered completely impossible for any nation to achieve. This revelation forced Japanese naval leaders to confront a devastating reality that undermined their entire strategic approach. America's industrial capacity represented a dimension of modern warfare that they had severely and perhaps fatally underestimated from the very beginning. If battle damage that Japanese yards would require many months to repair properly could be fixed by Americans in mere days, then the entire mathematical calculus of attrition warfare simply collapsed. The implications extended far beyond naval repair capabilities. Japanese strategy had been built on the fundamental assumption that American morale would quickly crumble after suffering initial defeats, which would lead to a negotiated peace favorable to Japan. Instead, the United States had demonstrated not only the national will to continue fighting, but also the industrial capacity to rapidly replace combat losses at a rate Japan could never hope to match. In Washington, The Naval Board reviewed detailed reports from Midway with particular attention paid to the Yorktown repairs and what they represented. The emergency techniques that had been developed at Pearl Harbor were being carefully studied for potential application throughout the entire fleet. More importantly, the psychological impact of the repair feat had resonated throughout the naval establishment and had boosted morale considerably. Admiral Ernest King, who served as Chief of Naval Operations, summarized the key lesson in a detailed memo to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. He wrote that the Yorktown repair demonstrated conclusively that American technical ingenuity, when properly motivated and efficiently organized, could accomplish what enemy planners considered completely impossible. This capability represented a strategic advantage that was perhaps even more significant than any tactical innovation or new weapon system. Indeed, as the Pacific War progressed relentlessly, America's industrial advantage would prove absolutely decisive in determining the final outcome. By 1944, American shipyards were producing Essex-class aircraft carriers at the remarkable rate of 1 per month, with each new carrier being more powerful than any carrier Japan had lost at Midway. Japanese naval construction, severely constrained by limited industrial capacity and increasingly scarce resources, could not even begin to match this production pace. Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose code-breaking had been instrumental to the Midway victory, later reflected thoughtfully that the Japanese never fully comprehended the true extent of American industrial potential. He observed that the Yorktown repair was merely the first demonstration of what American shipyards and factories could accomplish when fully mobilized for total war. The human aspect of the repair effort had equally profound consequences that extended beyond mere production statistics. The diverse workforce at Pearl Harbor, representing America's genuinely multicultural society, stood in stark contrast to the ethnically homogeneous Japanese empire. This diversity, which had initially been seen as a potential weakness by Japanese strategists, proved instead to be a tremendous source of strength, bringing together varied perspectives and specialized skills in service of a common goal that transcended individual differences. For Japanese naval officers throughout the fleet, the psychological impact of discovering the Yorktown at Midway created a genuine crisis of confidence that would persist. If they had been so completely wrong about American repair capabilities, what other fundamental assumptions might be seriously flawed? This pervasive uncertainty would significantly influence Japanese decision-making throughout the remainder of the war, contributing to increasingly cautious deployments of remaining naval assets that ultimately ceded the initiative to American forces. Captain Mitsuo Fushida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack with such confidence, later wrote extensively about his changing perspective. He stated that the appearance of Yorktown at Midway, after they believed it was crippled or sunk, had created a sense among many Japanese officers that American industrial capacity was almost magical in its capabilities. This powerful impression only deepened as the war continued relentlessly, until many Japanese officers came to privately believe that American production advantages made eventual defeat completely inevitable. The emergency repair of the Yorktown thus represented far more than simply a remarkable technical achievement by skilled workers. It became a powerful symbol of fundamental differences between the opposing powers that would determine the war's outcome. Japan, with its limited industrial capacity and increasingly restricted access to essential resources, could not replace combat losses at any sustainable rate. America, with its vast industrial potential that was only beginning to be fully realized, could not only replace losses, but could continuously expand its forces at an accelerating pace that would eventually overwhelm any opponent. Admiral Nimitz, reflecting thoughtfully on the Midway victory many years later, observed that the work of those 1,400 shipyard workers during those critical 72 hours at Pearl Harbor was every bit as important to the final outcome as any combat action taken by pilots or sailors. They had demonstrated conclusively that American industrial power, when properly applied with intelligence and determination, could overcome even the most dire circumstances imaginable. On September 17th in 1945, Commander H.J. Finstag, who had been promoted from his earlier rank, stood at the edge of Dry Dock No. 1 at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. This was the exact same facility where 3 years earlier he had overseen the miraculous repair of the Yorktown under seemingly impossible conditions. Around him, the shipyard continued its important work, though the urgent wartime pace had naturally slowed considerably following Japan's unconditional surrender the previous month. Many of the workers who had participated in the Yorktown repair had moved on to other assignments. Some had transferred to other shipyards across the country. Others had returned to civilian life. A few had tragically lost their lives when Japanese submarines had shelled Oahu in subsequent attacks. But their collective achievement had become an integral part of naval legend that would be remembered and studied for generations. Those 72 hours of continuous round-the-clock labor had helped fundamentally change the course of the Pacific War in ways that continued to resonate. Captain Claude Gillette, the yard superintendent who had coordinated the entire repair effort, remarked that it was hard to believe 3 full years had passed. Finstag replied that sometimes it felt like yesterday, while other times it seemed like it had happened in another lifetime entirely. The repair of the Yorktown had significantly influenced naval practice throughout the remainder of the war in numerous ways. Emergency repair techniques that had been developed during those 3 frantic days had been systematically refined and applied across the Pacific theater. Forward repair ships and floating dry docks had been deployed to advanced bases, enabling damaged vessels to return to combat operations without the long and dangerous journey back to major shipyards on the American West Coast. Perhaps even more significantly, the psychological impact of the repair had resonated throughout the war among American forces. American sailors knew with absolute certainty that their nation would make extraordinary efforts to repair damaged ships and return them to battle as quickly as humanly possible. Japanese commanders, by contrast, never fully recovered from the profound shock of discovering that American industrial capacity could accomplish what they had deemed impossible. The Yorktown itself now rested permanently at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, having finally succumbed to torpedo damage 2 days after the Battle of Midway. But its legacy lived on in tangible form through the 15 Essex-class carriers that had been constructed during the war, massive vessels that dwarfed their predecessor in both size and capability. In September of 1947, a new aircraft carrier would be commissioned bearing the proud name Yorktown, designated CV-10. This second Yorktown would serve with distinction for nearly 3 full decades, serving as a living memorial to its namesake and to the miracle workers of Pearl Harbor who had given the first Yorktown its final decisive mission that helped turn the tide of war. The story of the Yorktown's repair represented much more than simply a technical achievement by skilled craftsmen. It embodied the distinctly American approach to warfare, where Japanese military culture placed primary emphasis on warrior spirit and battlefield courage. American victory ultimately came through superior industrial might, technical innovation, and organizational efficiency that could mobilize entire populations. Gillette asked, breaking the comfortable silence if Finstag remembered what stood out most in his memory from that incredible time. Finstag asked what that was. Gillette replied that what he remembered most vividly was when Nimitz came down into the dry dock with water still swirling around his ankles and calmly told them they had 3 days to complete the work. The look of absolute shock on everyone's face at that moment was truly priceless and would stay with him forever. Finstag laughed at the memory and admitted that he had thought Gillette was going to have a heart attack right there on the spot, but they had done it against all odds. Gillette said simply that yes, they had accomplished the impossible. Finstag agreed quietly that yes, they had done it. In that critical moment 3 years earlier, standing ankle-deep in seawater at the bottom of dry dock number 1, none of the men present had fully comprehended how their work over the next 72 hours would impact the entire course of the war. They had simply faced an impossible task that seemed to defy all logic and had found a way to accomplish it through innovation, determination, and the collective effort of 1,400 dedicated workers who understood what was at stake. The miracle repair of the Yorktown had demonstrated beyond any doubt that in modern warfare, industrial capacity could be every bit as decisive as courage under fire on the battlefield. It was a lesson the Japanese learned far too late to change their fate, and one that would fundamentally shape American military planning for many generations to come. If American shipyards could repair major battle damage in mere days, rather than the months that Japanese yards required, then Japan's entire ability to inflict meaningful attrition on American naval forces was severely compromised. The implications of this realization extended far beyond naval warfare to encompass the entire strategic balance throughout the Pacific theater.